people are the new patients diagnosed as cancer patients for 2024, and 600,000 are projected to die as per the American Cancer Society. It's not without reason that the focus on early stage detection of cancer has made a lot of advancement, and that's the focus of today's webinar here.
Some mentioned 2 million cancer patients and over 600,000 deaths just in the United States. That translates to every 50 seconds, one cancer patient dies. It's a dreaded disease, we know that. What Som didn't mention is there are over 50 million cancer survivors in the world, 11 million in India. Okay, and if you look at the history for 5 decades, we still haven't conquered this problem. Because science alone is not good enough. We have to now have, excitement is all about at the intersection of science and data science, AI and ML, playing a crucial role in transforming this field. That's where the action is at the intersection. And the transformation has to be, the traditional route of you diagnose, you treat, and you hope for no such thing as cure, remission, because there's no cure in cancer. Transforming that to you don't wait for bad things to happen to you. Oftentimes you hear, oh, we diagnosed, but late stage, too little, too late. Changing that to screen, you predict and you prevent. And that is really the potential. Now, in cancer, one shoe doesn't fit all. Personalization is the only way to deal with individuals. So precision oncology, as we call it, that's the future of cancer management, and that is driven by biomarkers. The first, sort of the thing was with genomics. Now we know genomics alone isn't enough. Okay, that first wave, took us further, but not to the finish line. It is now the multi-omics. Tissue is often an issue, so we hear liquid biopsy. These are sort of the common terms these days are getting more popular. That's because ctDNA alone is not enough, not sufficient. And so a true representative of, the cancer in the body is circulating tumor cells. NGS, some of you may have heard, this is the next gen sequencing. And then a lot of data gets generated. Scientists get excited about this gene, this mutation, this protein, this transcriptomics. But oncologists often ask the question, so what does that mean to me as a practicing oncologist who have barely 10, 15 minutes with the patient, if at all, and they have to make the critical clinical decision at the point of care, and so I think this is really a challenge. What we believe the future holds is in liquid biopsy with what we call the true single cell multiomics biomarker that are analyzed using AI and ML. So awesome science coupled with great data science to not wait, but to be able to do the prediction. And this is really some of the work that we do. You screen, you predict, and you prevent the reoccurrence in our case. Now, we are very, fortunate to have, great panelists here. But just a little bit on CWC, Som mentioned, it's a not-for-profit focused on health and wellness. Again, we always say prevention is better than cure. It's easier said than done. So it is a not-for-profit network focusing on health and wellness. 4 pillars, for CWC: patients, providers, which is primarily the doctor patrons who have taken the holistic approach, not just pop the pill, but really taking the integrative holistic approach. The vendors, and I think Som mentioned a little bit about, both personalization as well as the wellness mart. And last but not the least, bringing patient in the center to inspire those who fought the battle successfully. We call them health heroes. Those 4, pillars with a mission, what we call the EIEIO. You educate, you inspire, you enable, enable the doctors, enable the patients to create an impact. Okay, and finally, to organize, specific events, quarterly, monthly, and of course, one annual event. Now, a little bit about the cancer track. We had taken sort of follow the journey of a cancer patient. Last quarter we did prevention. This is the one with early detection. I know there's a lot of excitement around this topic, and particularly in Bay Area, where we are all being bombarded by the AI and AI. And healthcare is the last industry left, which has not used technology to the same extent at other industries like finance, and telecom and others. Then we also have the diagnostics and therapy selection. How does AI play a role in personalizing, the therapy? And then finally, the monitoring. We have for cancer track sort of a webinar every quarter and annual symposium on August 24th. So that's a little bit about that. We're very fortunate to have a phenomenal panel today. Dr. Kevin Knopf, a practicing oncologist who cares about the patient, really genuinely, and particularly his interest is to manage toxicity, de-escalation, and so on and so forth. An MIT trained engineer turned into a doctor, went to places like UCSF, research, at NIH, particularly focusing on, health equity, inclusion, diversity, affordability, and so on and so forth. He's the head of the department of Highland Hospital. Gilead just gave him a grant for doing a clinical trials with the diversity. And I won't do justice, to all his accomplishment. And I'll request each one of our speakers to, introduce when we start. But followed by Dr. Kevin Knopf would be Dr. Girish Pucha. I classify him as a clinical scientist, MD, PhD, WashU, Stanford, tremendous academic background, a medico who also saw the dark side, the VC, as well as the payer side. But really, I classify him as really an entrepreneur at heart who co-founded terrific, organizations, like CardioDX, Verasight, amongst others. And last but not the least, Freenom, earlier known very well for the early detection, raising over $1.25 billion, capital with capital B. So that's the sort of the need of the space. And last but not the least, my co-host, Dr. Padma Srinivasan. She's also a doctor patron, comes with a tremendous background of a holistic approach. When in doubt, if you do the screening, you do this stuff, then what do you do? What are the do's and don'ts in terms of taking, responsible for the overall integrated approach? And then finally, we'll open up, for question and answer. So with that, theme in mind, we'll hold the questions to the end if you can. Let me, present to you Dr. Kevin Knopf.
Thank you so much for inviting me to speak. It's really quite an honor to speak for this organization, whose interests are after my own heart. In the daily job, I'm a clinical oncologist at Highland Hospital in Oakland, which is a safety net hospital that cares for underserved patients who often present with very advanced stages of cancer. And I think a lot of that is due to lack of access to proper medical care and proper screening, and decrease in health literacy, which is hard to overcome. But we see, compared to my time at academic centers and private practice, we see a lot of advanced presentations of malignancies. And once in a while, we see a person with a very curable cancer who presents so late that we can't cure them. And that sort of things happens throughout the world, and parts of America, and rural parts of America. So I'm going to start with a little bit of prevention and then talk a little bit about some of the dilemmas with screening, to give an overview. Part of my training that's relevant for this, I don't want to go through my bio per se, but I did a fellowship at the National Cancer Institute in medical oncology, which is learning how to treat cancer and how to design clinical trials. And a separate fellowship was in cancer prevention and control. So a lot of my thoughts regarding that come from the training I had there. There's a special branch there called the Division of Cancer Prevention and Control. So when we talk about prevention of cancer, we talk about primary prevention, which are things that we can do to our behavior to decrease cancer risk on the individual level, or that can be done on the societal level, which is where public health comes into play. And secondary prevention, we usually refer to as screening. That term secondary prevention is not widely used, but screening for cancers, again, at an individual level or population-wide with national programs or international programs for cancer screening, is referred to as secondary prevention. And the high-tech stuff is very interesting and the way of the future for screening and secondary prevention. Primary prevention is very low-tech and not a lot of change from year to year, but it is fairly effective. So I wanted to go through that to start with. These are things that we can do as individuals, and we can also work on doing as societies and getting organizations and NGOs and governments to involve to eradicate some of the sources of cancer. The first thing we can do that we hear every day is what we choose about our diet nutrition. Michael Pollan, who's written some books and is a big speaker, summarizes as that eat food, not too much, and mostly plants. So we think there's very good data that those of us who can work towards having a vegetarian diet or as close to it as possible have a markedly decreased risk of developing cancer, particularly for cancers of the GI tract, where what we eat has direct exposure to the epithelium and we know can increase the risk of cancer. The things to try and avoid are processed food, highly processed foods, saturated fats, red meats, and grilled red meats, which have their own set of carcinogens, as well as eating too much on any given day. There's a good data that you can try and remember that Japanese people, when they were in Japan in the 20th century, had very low incidences of breast cancer, colon cancer, and prostate cancer. But when they started moving to America and adopted the regular American diet, those cancer incidences went way up. So it's not genetics in that situation, it's clearly environment and what we eat. Another diet that's also talked about a lot is the Mediterranean diet. There's some great books on that, one by Walter Willett and some other ones. The Mediterranean diet is fresh fruits and vegetables, non-processed foods, low saturated foods. There's a lifestyle there with communal eating and very little dessert and very little red meat. And part of the Mediterranean diet that has become a little bit more controversial is drinking red wine with meals. So I don't know if everybody looked today, but Morgan Spurlock passed away, and there were some articles about him in the newspapers. He was famous for doing a movie called Super Size Me, where he ate nothing but double portions of McDonald's for a month and watched his health deteriorate. And he died very young at 53 of cancer. It's not stated what time, but as I read some more about him, he was also an alcoholic. And we know that alcohol is related to cancer. I like to think my interpretation of the literature is correct, which is that modest alcohol use does not really increase your incidence of cancer, because typically the cancers I've seen due to alcohol are from chronic exposure and high doses. For example, alcohol that causes chronic pancreatitis can lead to pancreatic cancer. And patients who have esophageal cancer from alcohol or head and neck cancer typically have a high amount of alcohol per day. So that's a tougher decision. But wine doesn't seem to protect from cancer, which is what was fashionable to think about for about 10 or 20 years. So number one is diet nutrition. Number two is tobacco. Do not smoke, vape, or use tobacco. If you do quit, the carcinogens in tobacco are products that are exposed directly to the epithelium of the lung, the mouth, the esophagus, and quitting smoking will markedly decrease your risk of getting cancer. In fact, the data shows that if you quit smoking completely within 10 years, your risk of getting lung cancer is pretty much the same as if you never smoked. And we have some worldwide issues with smoking. In America, there was greater knowledge about smoking and cancer starting in 1965, and the tobacco companies saw that smoking rates were dropping in America, and so they went to the third world, where smoking is also a big cause of cancer. It's clear that exercise is very healthy for you. You don't need to become a marathon runner. 30 minutes of aerobic exercise 3 times a week or more gets you on the path towards better health, decreased risk of cancer, and decreased risk of cardiovascular disease. And the nice thing about number 1, 2, and 3, primary prevention, not only decreases your risk of getting cancer, but it will also decrease your risk of getting coronary artery disease and stroke. So you get a lot of benefits from changing your lifestyle. I'm not sure that stress is a causative agent for cancer, and we tried to think that it was for heart disease, but certainly if you can temper your reactions to life's stress, you'll have a better sense of well-being. Avoiding obesity, so independent of your diet, obesity turns out to be an independent risk factor for a lot of bowel cancers. So trying to get your body mass index below 30 or below the appropriate for your body type is a noble endeavor. That seems to be mostly related to diet rather than exercise, but both are very important. Use sunblock and a hat when outside. We see melanoma, and I think the data is best that melanoma is related to not the total amount of sun exposure, but to periodic sunburns. And there's a big melanoma belt in Australia where melanoma incidence is very high. Get vaccinated. These two viruses, hepatitis B and human papillomavirus, are responsible for a lot of cancers worldwide. And it would be a very simple thing to vaccinate people worldwide and eradicate these malignancies, except access to vaccines is not uniform across the world. I think in America, most children are offered hepatitis B and HPV vaccine. And hepatitis B is linked very strongly to hepatocellular carcinoma. Human papillomavirus is linked very strongly to 5 malignancies, including cervical cancer, anal cancer, and oropharyngeal cancer, all of which are on the rise in America. So these would be very easy cancers to eradicate. It's not a intellectual or biologic problem anymore. It's a public health problem about getting people vaccinated. And the last one is to avoid environmental toxins. Certain cities have very high levels of pollution. Beijing has now a very high level of pollution and an increase in many cancers there. It's not always possible to pick where you live, but avoiding air pollution and industrial toxins can help. There turns out to be more toxins being discovered and worked on that are turning in the air, water, and food. A lot of occupational exposures. Benzene is known to cause AML for more than 100 years now. Roundup has been linked to non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and you may have seen some of the lawsuits on that. Other pesticides and herbicides are linked to hematopoietic malignancies. Chronobiology is a very interesting topic. I finished a book by Russell Foster recently about chronobiology and how we match up our life, our day-to-day life, with the regular sun rise and fall can have an increased incidence on a lot of diseases. So there's a relationship between people who work at night with neon lights who have a higher incidence of cancers. And then we're reading more and more about PFAS and forever chemicals and their relation to adverse health events. This last point, be lucky, and this quote from Ray Charles, there are a lot of cancers, I think, that just occur in people who are thin and otherwise healthy. And some cancers, I think, are just a result of bad luck or things that we don't understand that cause them. I can think of young patients with devastating brain tumors, glioblastoma multiforme, as most of the time being quite unlucky. So we want to focus on that as much as possible. Not something we can change, and it's sort of a trite saying, but luck does play a role in who gets cancer and who doesn't, which is why we think a lot about secondary prevention and screening for cancers or early diagnosis of symptoms. There was a lot of research, and there's still some research on chemoprevention, which is things you can take to decrease your risk of cancer. And there are some FDA-approved indications for tamoxifen and raloxifene for decreasing the risk of breast cancer for patients who have a very high risk of getting breast cancer. That can be done. Aspirin can prevent colon cancer in patients who have a genetic syndrome called HNPCC. These are not widely used in the population. But for certain patients, this may be very effective, and I think research continues in this area. Screening for cancer is the idea of picking up a cancer at a very early and treatable stage, such that your overall life survival is back to the same as if it was before. And these are the 5 cancers that we screen for, mostly in the US, where we've got evidence-based regarding screening, although as I'll talk about, screening depends very much on your pretest probability of having that underlying cancer. So we have breast cancer screening, mammography, the age of which has now been lowered to 40 in the last set of iterations. We have ultrasound and MRI. Biologically, for younger women, it's harder to pick up a breast cancer on mammography. So for screening for younger patients, sometimes we rely on MRI, particularly for patients who have a BRCA mutation who are in a screening program. For colorectal cancer, I think this is the test that has the best data about screening and survival. You can do fecal occult blood test. You can do a blood test that looks at certain mutations called Cologuard that you'll see on TV, and you can do colonoscopy. The ages for these have been lowered recently to age 45, and some would say 40 in African Americans. And screening programs are usually accessible to people who are insured and have health literacy. The test there can not only pick up a cancer early, but can remove a precancerous polyp, preventing you from getting a cancer. Cervical cancer, unfortunately, cervical cancer and endometrial cancer in the United States are increasing in mortality for reasons that are not totally clear, but cervical cancer is detectable at early stages because of its long natural history with Pap smear, and now I think we're moving more to HPV testing, recognizing the nearly ubiquitous role of HPV in cervical cancer. So patients who have access to medical care should be screened for cervical cancer appropriately and diagnosed at a very early curable stage. Prostate cancer is definitely screened for in the United States with a test called PSA. I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then more recently, the last one that we've added is lung cancer for patients who are at high risk for lung cancer, which would be those who are still smoking or have quit smoking for less than 10 years, who have 30-pack years or more. And the screening there is low-dose CT followed by additional studies if a nodule is detected. Now we're doing tremendous work in cancer-causing genes and figuring out who might be at a higher risk for cancer due to germline mutations or hereditary predispositions. Some of these I mentioned here, BRCA1 and 2, HNPCC, and most centers, particularly academic centers, have aggressive screening programs to detect these cancers early in a very enriched population. And there's a whole field called genetic counseling, where patients can be counseled regarding their probabilities and family history. So we're always on the lookout now in clinical oncology for familial clusters or familial cancer syndromes that we can not only help the patient with, because some of these are now targetable, these genes, but also their family and warn them and get them in screening programs. The problem with understanding screening, which is a fairly ubiquitous problem among physicians, is understanding some biostatistics. So there are four main terms that we talk about. One is the ability to detect something in people who do have a disease, which is called sensitivity, and specificity, which is the ability of a test to say that patients do not have disease. And the positive predictive value and negative predictive value, the positive predictive value means that a person with a positive test has the disease, and negative predictive value means that a person with a negative test does not have the disease. And at the first level, I think people, including physicians, think that if you have a test and the test is positive, that means the person has the disease. So these concepts are usually taught at some point, but they're very hard to understand. I think for many people, that the accuracy of a test depends on the underlying pretest probability of that. So these are grids that we'll draw on the board when we're teaching interns or residents about tests for sensitivity and specificity, meaning if you have a negative test, you don't have that disease, which is very important in a screening test, because a screening test is usually followed by an invasive test to confirm the diagnosis. Positive predictive value and negative predictive value. So I think a lot of the audience is probably involved in artificial intelligence and neural networks, and so are familiar with the concept of Bayesian analysis, which is not a common concept taught to medical students and residents, but we use Bayesian analysis day to day as clinical doctors, and so it is very important to understand it. But the pretest probability of having an underlying disease, in this case cancer, influences how accurate the diagnostic test is. If the pretest probability is very high, the test becomes more accurate. If it's very low, the test becomes less accurate and has a lower predictive value. So these are two new directions in screening that we'll hear more about that get in the newspaper very often, because the technology is very interesting. It's technology that built upon the revolution of molecular biology that really happened in the 1970s. And there's a lot of enthusiasm for detecting cancer early, obviously. So I'll touch on a little bit of radiologic screening and then blood-based tests that are making the news today. So this is from April 15th. Private equity-backed firm launches with an AI startup to launch nationwide whole-body MRI offerings. And at first value, this seems like a very good thing. You can have an MRI and pick up a cancer early. MRI doesn't have radiation; it works in different ways, so you're not going to cause cancer by doing it. But there are problems with widespread screening for cancer. Some common harms to think about. These concepts are also very sort of hard for physicians to understand, but a lead time bias means you pick up a diagnosis of cancer early, but you don't have any improvement in mortality. So all you've done there is sort of make the patient nervous and anxious, but you're not actually lengthening their lives. And then length time bias is cancers that are slowly progressive, where detecting them might not make a difference in the patient's outcome. It's a good model to think of that was adapted by Gil Welch about different animals in cancer and how screening might affect them. So the red animal, the bird, these are cancers that grow so quickly that screening won't detect them in time. And for patients who are getting regular screening, such as mammography every year, every other year, when these cancers show up, they tend to be very aggressive, and they're called interval cancers. And it's not because the screening test necessarily failed. It didn't. It's just because the cancer is growing so quickly that it happened between the two screening tests. And then the rabbit is sort of our goal in screening, something that grows slowly enough that when we pick it up, we'll have a difference in the outcome through our screening tests. So we want to make every sort of cancer screening test as close to picking up rabbits and not picking up turtles or snails as possible. But the turtles and the snails are cancers that are growing very slowly or not growing at all. And in fact, cancer growth it follows nonlinear dynamics, and it's likely that cancers can go away in your body that may have been picked up on a screening test or that may never grow at all. So when you pick up those cancers in a screening test, it's called overdiagnosis. These are cancers that are overdiagnosed and that are a big subject of debate and literature. One is low-grade prostate cancer, because we do a lot of PSA screening. And so we've adopted a different stance for these low-grade prostate cancers, which is called active surveillance, where the patients will be monitored and only treated if the cancer sort of grows. So we get a better natural history of those cancers. Ductal carcinoma in situ of the breast, there's a lot of this detected with the use of mammography, and we're not really improving the cure rate of these patients at all. Definitely we're overdiagnosing. So we're looking for ways to de-escalate these. In breast cancer, some of the breast cancers are actually snails or turtles and are overdiagnosed. Papillary thyroid cancer and then melanoma too can be overdiagnosed. So this was a striking example from South Korea, where they decided to start doing ultrasounds on large portions of their population to detect thyroid cancer early. And this is a classic sort of graph for overdiagnosis. They started screening, and the blue line shows that the incidence of cases dramatically increased. The mortality did not change at all. So these are overdiagnosed cases. And the downside of this are personal anxiety for the patients who think that they now have a terrible cancer, as well as the treatment. In the case of thyroid cancer, they usually undergo surgery, they may undergo radiation, they may need to be put on thyroid medicine for the rest of their life. So we are seeing a lot of thyroid cancers in America with, for example, PET scans. We pick up these thyroid nodules that we wouldn't have felt before. So the incidence of thyroid cancer is also going up in the United States, and it's not clear we're affecting the mortality. And I should say this is the most common subtype of thyroid cancer, called papillary thyroid cancer here. This is another look at it in South Korea, and you can see on the right that the percent of adults who were screened went from 10% to 25%, with no benefit from that for individual patients or for the country at large. Screening tests should be highly sensitive and specific to detect asymptomatic and early disease. Again, patients with a high prevalence are going to have a higher positive predictive value. The test itself should be relatively safe and cost-effective. One of the issues with the screening MRIs that some physicians will worry about is that the MRI is paid for out of pocket, but then when something abnormal is found on the MRI, it's the regular health system that pays for all the biopsies and testing that follows that. And if you think about it, California, more than half of the people are on public insurance, either Medicaid or Medicare. And the rest of the insurances in America, it's not a free ride, because we all pay for those insurance costs out of our salaries at work, and those premiums have been going up by 15% every year. So we might think that MRI screening makes sense at first, but it is a very expensive downstream testing cascade. And then we want to have screening for disease where early identification and treatment have been shown to improve clinical outcomes. We don't want to screen for something that we don't have any good treatment for. The remainder of this talk is extremely controversial, and these are graphs that come from England, and many oncologists and breast surgeons actually believe this, but are not willing to say it in public. but it's thought that screening for breast cancer may save a small percentage of lives at the counter side of having a large percent of patients who are overdiagnosed with breast cancer. So there's the problem with the anxiety of having a cancer that may never have harmed you, as well as all the biopsies and procedures that went there. And again, this will be better in an enriched population with a higher pretest probability, but we feel that breast cancer screening with mammography has overdiagnosis, particularly if you do it in women between 40 and 50, where the sensitivity and specificity will fall. This may be outdated, that prostate cancer does not save any lives, according to this graph. There's certainly a lot of men who are overdiagnosed, but what happened is the U.S. Preventive Task Force for a while said no to PSA screening, and then as a result of that, we saw a lot more men with metastatic prostate cancer. So I think the needle has probably swung back on PSA screening. It does have a lot of harms with it, with overdiagnosis, but I think that the data is a little bit better about PSA having a role. Although the gentleman who developed the PSA test did not think that it should ever be used as a screening test. And now with these patients with low-grade prostate cancer, we can put them on active surveillance and perhaps spare them from treatment that's not needed. So these are the harms with screening tests that are false positives: incorrect labeling, which can be psychologically difficult for patients, inconvenience, expense, physical harm in some of the follow-up tests, and imaging can pick up what's called an incidentalloma, which is an abnormality that doesn't actually correspond to a disease. This is called the screening cascade. Persons who are screened can ultimately end up in the lower left corner of this with benefit, where they have earlier treatment that works better. But there's a lot of false positives, indeterminate findings, incidental findings that can get you to the right side with no benefit. And so the thing here that we hope for from technology, from genomics and proteomics and AI, is to shift the balance of screening so that we end up in the lower left-hand corner much more often than we do in the lower right-hand corner. There's a great article that I read every couple months by the brilliant writer Siddhartha Mukherjee from the Wall Street Journal on December 17, 2021, that talks about some of these issues with screening with ctDNA and screening with imaging, titled "Will We All Soon Live in Cancerland?" And it gives a very balanced sort of opinion about how these patients will deal with the fact that they've been diagnosed with cancer that may not actually harm them. And so I would urge anybody really interested in the topic to just pull that up on the internet and read it then. So in summary, primary prevention of cancer is always worthwhile. It may prevent cancer for you. It may also prevent you from having heart attacks, strokes, other diseases, type 2 diabetes, both at an individual level and a population level, certainly in other countries besides the US as well. Being healthy is associated with a better sense of well-being and a higher quality of life. Screening, or secondary prevention, has well-documented benefit from screening tests, and I talked about the 5 most commonly done ones here. The pretest probability affects the accuracy of any screening tests, and the potential harms are overdiagnosis, unnecessary testing, and worry. And I believe that over time we'll continue to improve our ratio of benefit for screening for cancer. We're still working out the biology. Every month new things come out and newer technologies are evolving. So thank you very much.
Move over to Dr. Girish, who's a clinical scientist. So pass it on to Girish.
As Mohan said, I'm an MD PhD by training. My clinical specialization is in molecular genetics and pathology, but over the course of my career, I've sort of worn a number of different hats, and it's sort of followed an eclectic path. So right out of my training, I went into venture capital and private equity for a period of time. Then I completed my training. I helped start 2 molecular diagnostic companies, one in cancer, one in cardiovascular disease. And then I went back into venture capital and private equity for a period of time. And then I came back out of that and have been in a series of companies and focused in various areas, from rheumatology to prenatal screening to cancer treatment selection. And most recently, as Mohan said, was at a company called Freenome that's using artificial intelligence and machine learning combined with multi-omics for various applications, with an initial focus in multi-cancer screening. But also during that time, I was working as a medical director with CMS, looking at reviewing and assessing these tests for coverage and reimbursement by Medicare. and have also served on CMS's MedCAC. So, like I said, it's sort of been like an unexpected trip, to say the least. So, for what I want to talk about was sort of laid out at a high level on this slide. Spent a little time taking a slightly different or sort of related time on just what screening is versus diagnosis, talk about what multi-cancer screening is, a few notes and sort of perspectives that I couldn't stick anywhere else, to focus a little bit on early, what exactly we mean when we say early detection, talk a little bit about at least what is good enough, so to speak, for tests like this, in my view at least, to be useful, but also some of the debates that are going on in the community, the scientific and clinical community, as well as with the FDA, with CMS, and so forth. And then I guess my take about, for lack of a better way to put it, whether we're there yet. So one of the first things to the point that Kevin was making that I really want to drive home to this audience is the difference between screening and diagnosis, right? Because as Kevin said, even unfortunately physicians frequently get this, or I shouldn't say they get it wrong, but I think they still struggle with this sometimes in understanding the differences. And patients, I know in my experience, most definitely do. So screening is, in the case of cancer, and I'm just going to focus on cancer for the moment, but you could, put in any disease you want where I have cancer right now. It's basically testing for a cancer in an individual who has no signs or symptoms of cancer, right? And so a positive screening result means that you may have cancer. That is in contrast to a truly diagnostic procedure or diagnosis where it's actually the confirmation that you do have cancer. So a positive diagnostic test means you actually have cancer. And I just sort of related in an area that I worked in quite extensively that unfortunately I see us repeating many of the same mistakes in cancer screening as was done with these prenatal tests, right? So this was an article published by ProPublica, as you can see, back in 2022, but this really had been, going on for at least almost a decade, or almost before that. And the challenge is that women were getting these prenatal tests that are just screening tests. They were getting a positive result or a negative result, and in the case of a positive result, they were unfortunately terminating pregnancies on the basis of a screening test that was subsequently determined to be a natural and sort of a normal, if you want to put it that way, child. And the converse also happened, where the test was negative, and then they had subsequently delivered a child with one of the conditions that the test was designed to test for. So obviously, there's sort of two pieces to this. First of all, there is no such thing as a perfect test, as we all know. And so the challenge is you can have, as Kevin pointed out, sort of false negatives and false positives, even with a very good screening test, and even with a very good a diagnostic is a little bit, probably shouldn't really talk about it there, because it's really with a screening test. But then the other problem is the fact that even a very good screening test is just a screening test. It does not mean you actually have the disease. So it's really important to keep the distinction between these two in mind. So multi-cancer screening is, what it sounds like. It's basically screening for multiple cancers at the same time. And the desire is sort of obvious, right? At the end of the day, even in 2024, USPSTF, which is the United States Preventive Services Task Force, did not recommend screening for cancers in which they did not recommend screening, represented over half of all new cancers that were diagnosed and over half of all cancer-related deaths this year. And so, in 2023. So the other thing that's interesting is a trend that Kevin spoke to, I guess that he was referring to in cervical cancer, but has also been more widely reported because of Chadwick Boseman and various other folks, and that is an increase in the deaths in younger, defined here as under the age of 50, under the age of 50. So that's been happening in the U.S. and I think even more globally as well. As far as I'm aware, other than the example that Kevin gave in cervical cancer, I'm not sure that this has been happening in other cancers that are currently recommended for screening in the general population. And so that brings us to sort of, what cancers are recommended for screening in sort of the general population. And so I'm only using here the USPSTF. You could look at ACS, and many of these things will align, but different guidelines and different entities often have sort of slightly different recommendations in terms of either the populations or the frequencies or so forth. But USPSTF, I think it is fair to say in the United States, is probably considered sort of the gold standard. I think they do the most robust analysis of the data, and at least at some level are reasonably independent of commercial influence, but certainly not wholly independent of such commercial influence. So they have a grading system, and you see that grading system, on the right-hand side of the screen, which is, basically kind of almost like regular grades, A, B, C, D, and then there's not an F, but there's an I. But I'll come back to sort of the meaning of those in a second. So what's important to note is that anything that is USPSTF A or B under the Affordable Care Act is basically required to be covered by any payer in the United States, with essentially no patient responsibility. Means that you should not have to pay. It's sort of $0 out of pocket. Okay, so if you're A or B on their list, it needs to be covered. And so the ones that are A and B on the list are the ones listed here, right? Cervical, colorectal, breast, and lung. And I just wanted to share with you, so the populations I won't go through, but I think what's kind of interesting is sort of that fourth column on the percent screen. You can see there's a huge variation in how many people who are recommended to get such screening actually get such screening. The one that's obviously the most abysmal here is lung cancer, where only about 6% of the population that is appropriate for screening actually gets screened. So then what I also want to touch on, though, Kevin also kind of hinted at, if you see at the bottom, is that there were, well, let me do this. I want to review for a second just what the grades mean, right? So again, an A grade, just to read the words on the screener, it's a high certainty that the net benefit, so balancing harms and benefits, is actually substantial. So clearly those are, at least relatively speaking, clear winners, right? B's are also good in the sense that this is recommended, which means that there's a high certainty that the net benefit is at least moderate. Okay, with C, which is where prostate cancer sits, at least in the latest iteration of the recommendations, but it is actually, I think, being updated as we speak. This is where there is moderate certainty that the net benefit is actually small. And you saw that from Kevin's slide. And I think this is the challenge, is that in general, things that are C mean that this is basically a discussion between the patient and the provider to try to do their own individual balance of risks and benefits. And then D is important because there are actually cancers that the USPSTF recommend not get screened in the general population. And you can see that list includes thyroid, that Kevin had alluded to earlier, but also ovarian and pancreatic, right? And then the I's are basically, we just don't know enough to say one way or another whether there should be screening in the general population. And you can see that list includes bladder, oral, skin, and testicular cancer. Okay, so rather than talking about sort of, what anyone should want in a multi-cancer screening test, I'll just speak to what I would want for myself or my family in a multi-cancer screening test, right? And I'll come back at the end of all of this and kind of grade where I believe we are with what is currently available, or at least emerging onto the market as it relates to sort of, especially most, sort of blood-based multi-cancer screening. Okay. So high sensitivity, Kevin spoke to this, right? But which basically means you have a low rate of false negatives, but that you need to establish that high sensitivity in what's called the intended use population. So I apologize for a little bit of regulatory speak, but in simple terms, the intended use population is just the population that you plan to use the test in, right? So in other words, if you test or if you establish the performance of the test in a bunch of patients who have already been diagnosed with cancer, that is obviously not the population in which you're ultimately going to use this test. And this frankly, gets to, and what that does is it's very likely and has been shown repeatedly in the past to sort of overestimate the performance of the test. This gets to that pretest probability issue. Obviously, the pretest probability of somebody who's diagnosed with cancer for having that cancer is basically 1, right? 100%. They have the cancer. And so the bottom line is that establishing the performance of these tests in that population that you intend for the test to be used in is critical, but the challenge is, of course, that cancer, any individual cancer is, very rare, and even cancers in general, even if you were to combine them, are still relatively rare. And so what that ends up meaning is that you have to do large studies in order to establish what the sensitivity and specificity are. Okay, so as Kevin had said before, my second bullet point is just obviously you'd also want a high specificity, which means you have a low number of false positives in that same population. Obviously, we can choose whether we include cancers for which screening is currently recommended, given that we have existing screening technologies that are not perfect but perform reasonably well for certainly some of the cancers for which screening is recommended. And so if you include those cancers in your multi-cancer test, I would certainly want to have at least as good, if not better, performance versus that existing test, again, in the intended use population. Because the problem is, I think this is a real concern, it's certainly a public health concern, is that if somebody gets a multi-cancer screening test that includes, say, breast cancer, lung cancer, colorectal cancer, and cervical cancer, and is negative on the multi-cancer test for that cancer, they may walk away with a false sense of security and therefore skip the cancer screening, the standard of care cancer screening that has actually already been shown in many cases, or at least in some cases, to provide mortality benefit, right? To actually extend life and in principle extend the quality of that life as well. So the other thing you'd want to do is the fourth bullet here, which is you'd accurately want to know what kind of cancer it is, right? Again, it seems kind of logical, but there are effectively a few ways you could do this. One is as part of the multi-cancer test itself, and then the other, which is a strategy that's being taken by some companies in this space, is to basically just say you have cancer, right? But we don't know what type it is, or we don't want to make any claims about what type it is. Go get, this will sound familiar, effectively a whole body, or at least some part of the whole body PET CT scan, right? So it's sort of even taking the whole body MRI idea potentially even a step further, right? But it would be nice, of course, if the test itself, the multi-cancer screening test itself, could accurately identify, is it breast, lung, colorectal, or whatever, right? And then to Kevin's point, I certainly would want to know that getting this test is going to help in the broadest sense of the word, that it would actually improve health outcomes, by which I mean not just the quantity of life, but also the quality of that life, because I think both of those things are relevant. And I think, unfortunately, we often end up focused on the quantity and not the quality, whereas I think both are, important and valuable. And then finally, I think it's fairly obvious that you'd like it to be, relatively convenient and inexpensive, because both of those things will go directly to improving adherence with the screening, as well as just accessibility across the population, and especially ex-US to other populations across the world. So a few notes that I didn't really know where else to stick, but at the end of the day, depending upon the classification system that you use, there's over 100 types of cancers, right? So I think it's just really important to emphasize that none of the tests that are either commercially available today or in development are truly universal or pan-cancer tests, right? So I bristle a little bit anytime anyone uses that kind of terminology, especially with patients, because I think it's misleading and frankly potentially dangerous. And then the other thing, I'll at least share a bias that I have, at least based on my experiences, is sort of the obvious point, which is just because we can do something doesn't mean we should do something, and this gets directly to the unintended consequences of some of these tests and potentially turning everyone into a cancer patient, when in many cases, in my view, the goal is not so much as it makes for a great bumper sticker. The goal is not so much to, cure cancer, which I think would be wonderful, but may not be realistic, as opposed to turning cancer into a chronic disease, by which I mean it is something that you live with a high quality of life, and not that you necessarily die from, or I should say, die with and not necessarily die from. Okay, so then I want to take a moment to talk about early detection, because this is sort of the lingo of the day. And quite honestly, I will share with you my bias that this focus on early detection is a little bit of a sleight of hand, because obviously we have all learned from a very long time that detecting cancer earlier saves lives, right? It's sort of just taken as fact. And the problem is it's always the devil in the details, right? Because part of the reason why the discussion has gotten framed or termed early detection versus screening, which is what it really is that screening, quite honestly, has certain implications, both from a regulatory standpoint and from a payer coverage standpoint, that the companies want to avoid, and therefore they want to focus on early detection, right? So that's why they're called multi-cancer early detection tests, is a term you'll hear, or MCED is a term you'll hear, because they don't want to use the word screening when they talk about these tests because of what it implies to certain audiences. But the point that I want to make about early detection is that, as Kevin said, the goal of early detection is to improve clinical outcomes. But what you see on the left is basically shows you that what we already kind of know intuitively, which is different cancers are different, which basically means that what is early, meaning what is clinically useful in terms of detecting cancer early, is different for different cancers. And all I'm showing you on the left is a measure that is called the cure fraction, but at the end of the day, just think about it as the fraction of patients who get cured with that stage of cancer. So as you can see, you could get, as in the case of thyroid cancer or something like that, there isn't really much of a decrease across stages. You can go all the way to stage 4 and still have 80% plus survival, right? Whereas if you detect pancreatic cancer or gallbladder cancer or esophageal cancer in stage 2, right? So basically the highlighted section is this stage after which there is the greatest decrease in survival across all stages. And so you see that if you were to detect any of those cancers in stage 2, it's already potentially too late. Whereas with, again, the other cancers that you see near the bottom, breast, anus, prostate, so forth and so on, picking it up between stage 2 was probably good enough. And even stage 3 may be okay, but obviously you want to be effectively to the left of the yellow as much as in the yellow column as much as you can for that individual kind of cancer. The other point that I'll make relatively quickly is that detection is just saying that you can detect the cancer. It's not saying, it's what I would call validity, right? Which just means do you accurately and reproducibly detect the cancer, whereas utility really speaks to whether it is useful to detect that cancer, and that gets to the availability of sort of curative therapy and the stage at which you detect it, right? So this is just another way of potentially saying the same thing, but I just wanted to sort of drive this point home, which is what you need to achieve in terms of sensitivity, specificity, negative predictive values, and positive predictive values is different for different cancers, right? There is not a one-size-fits-all solution here, which is one of the challenges for multi-cancer screening. And I'll just give you, the 3 examples here: colorectal, breast, and ovarian, right? So colorectal has a grade A recommendation for USPSTF for screening. The idea there is you really want to, as much as possible, minimize false negatives. that you confirm it with a colonoscopy, but when you're trying to minimize false negatives, again, what you're really saying is that you want a high sensitivity test with a high NPV, right? Because what comes after it for diagnostic confirmation is a colonoscopy, which is invasive, but is relatively safe, right? And then you move over to breast cancer, which has a grade B recommendation. Here, to some extent, it's a balance, right? Obviously, you want as high sensitivity as you get, but you really want to minimize false positives because effectively there, what you're really doing in terms of diagnostic confirmation is more invasive, but is still, relatively speaking, benign, right? But you still would like a higher PPV there because you're trying to minimize the number of false positives. Ovarian cancer represents, on sort of at the other end of the spectrum, a much different challenge, right? And this is partly why it actually has a grade D recommendation from USPSTF, which means they actually recommend not screening the general population for ovarian cancer, because what follows a positive result for diagnostic confirmation is abdominal surgery. So now we're talking about something that has a very different risk-benefit profile just to establish the diagnosis than, say, colonoscopy at the other end. So here you really would like to have a very high PPV, very high specificity, so there are very few false positives and you're not sending women unnecessarily to major abdominal surgery. So in terms of the what's good enough, this is the struggle. This is actually a figure from a group called the Friends of Cancer Research that works closely with the FDA, and I was a part of this group that was just talking about sort of the continuum of endpoints and evidence that we're looking at, and where we kind of draw the line for what should be good enough for any of these tests to show to actually get on the market and get sort of robust coverage and reimbursement so that there's widespread access, right? And as you can see, clinical sensitivity and specificity are all the way on the left, and where we want to be ultimately in terms of the evidence is all the way on the right? We would like to see, or at least I would like to see, that using these tests actually improves, at a minimum, cancer-specific mortality and survival, and whether that's 5 years or lifetime or whatever, that we can get into this debate. But you can see there's a huge spread in the spectrum between sensitivity and where we actually want to get to, which is, do you improve the quality and quantity of life as a result of the use of these tests, right? And so the question that the field is struggling with is sort of how accurate any of the things that are to the left or in the middle are to predicting the things that are to the far right. And as I said again, whether this is actually different for different cancers, which evidence to date suggests it absolutely is. Okay, so then my final slide really, so where are we? Or, what's my assessment of where we are? So certainly none of the multi-cancer tests that are out there have high sensitivity, and certainly the ones that are out there, to my knowledge, have not established that performance in the intended use population. In terms of high specificity, this is really what they're shooting for. So not surprisingly, this is where they've set their targets. So they're in excess typically of 99% specificity. But the reason this box is yellow is because none of that has been done in the intended use population, which is a problem, a big problem in my view. Then if you look, the ones that are currently commercially available do include the cancers for which there is screening that is available in the already, and none of them come close to the performance of the guideline recommended screening tests, even acknowledging that some of those guideline recommended screening tests still, are imperfect and have much to be desired. But even given that, they haven't achieved anywhere remotely close to that performance in general. The next part about the accurate identification of the cancer type, as I said, there are other ways to establish the identification, the idea of the whole body PET CT, but of course those have their own challenges. But as far as the tests themselves go, they have generally on the order of about 80, depending upon the specific cancer type, the accuracy of identifying the type of cancer you have literally ranges anywhere from about 0% up to about 90%, but none of this has been done in the intended use population, which is why that box is yellow for me. Right now, the ones that are commercially available are blood tests, but they're folks looking at urine and so forth. So I think convenience is obviously there. In terms of expense, as you've seen if you've done any online searching, most of these run on the order of about $1,000. So, you know, depending upon your level of disposable income, that may be considered expensive or inexpensive, but certainly for the general population, that is not inexpensive. And certainly none of them have come remotely close to demonstrating that health outcomes actually improve, let alone, again, in the intended use population. And that's it. So thank you very much again for this opportunity and look forward to the questions.
I am going to request Dr. Padma, to give her perspective, because the CWC is all about the holistic approach. CWC is all about, taking the integrative approach. And, maybe Dr. Padma, you can introduce a little bit. I haven't done justice to your rich background. And then, share, your thoughts in terms of the holistic approach of looking at this, whole topic.
My approach is going to be why lifestyle matters. We heard about diagnostics, so I'm going to talk about why lifestyle is important and how it matters. So cancer is preponderantly a lifestyle disease. There are a couple of things we can't change: our genes and our age, because the older we get, there's more cancer. So because we accumulate genetic mutations, and we have immune senescence, and we have, more toxic exposures, etc. So those being there are other things we can change, even to overcome genetic cancers. We can do to improve our chances either from getting the remission or cure from cancer. So the factors about lifestyle are follows: the environment, our diet, our activity. The diet and activity then contribute to obesity or not, and the mental makeup, the stress, like psychological makeup. So we won't go through all of them, but some important points. So in the environment, what proof do we have? We have plenty, actually. Way before DDT was banned, there was a study done by Oakland Kaiser, where they drew blood from prepubescent females and they stored it. And years later, when some of them developed breast cancer, they found that those children who had the highest levels of DDT went on to develop breast cancer as women. So that's one. And the other thing is heterocyclic amines, that, when we cook muscle meat, whether it's fish or chicken or meat, when we cook it in high heat, then these compounds are formed and they are toxic, and they cause breast cancer, colorectal cancer, lung cancer, etc. So they are class 1 carcinogens. And then we have dioxins, which are also level 1 carcinogens. These are industrial pollutants. The thing is, they accumulate in fatty tissues, and they're found in animals, poultry, fish, and meat. But the one advantage of being a vegan or vegetarian is they are not found in vegetables. So, and dioxins these are forever chemicals. They last forever, and they are endocrine disruptors, and they've been associated with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. So, and the other group that I want is in common use, that it's in there are a lot of endocrine disruptors that cause, breast, ovarian, uterine, and prostate cancers, obesity linked, that, plastics and phthalates and bisphenol A, but parabens, there are multiple parabens, and these are as preservatives in our foods or cosmetics or medications even, and it's ubiquitous. Almost everybody in USA has a paraben load in them, and dioxin, everybody in the globe has body burden, And it's the Agent Orange that was sprayed in Vietnam is actually a dioxin. So coming back to parabens, these are endocrine disruptors, and they've been found in breast cancer tissue. Whether it causes that in the patients, we don't know, but we know in mice they do cause proliferation of mammary tissue. So there is some evidence for that. So we can avoid, why it's important is we can avoid parabens. Just look at the ingredients or in whatever you buy, your cosmetics or medications or food products. You can actually look at the labels and not buy it. And heterocyclic amines, don't cook your meat on high heat. Don't go for grilled or charred or whatever. And then we come to the pesticides, enormous numbers of pesticides in the US. And more than that, there are about 140,000 chemicals, synthetic chemicals that are used in US, about in US and in Europe, 140,000, and many more are being introduced every year. So many of them are pesticides. So the safe thing to do is to buy when you can, organic produce, because many of these pesticides are genotoxic, they're endocrine disruptors, and have been associated with cancers. So the Environmental Working Group puts out a dirty dozen every year. It's pretty constant, more or less. Some years tomatoes are there, this year green beans are there. So look it up, and those, preferably you do want to buy organic. And this year, the vegetables there are spinach, other leafy greens, green beans, bell peppers, peppers. The fruits are cherries, nectarines, peaches, apples, and 2 or 3 more. So the others, there are a whole slew of other vegetables and fruits you could enjoy, the not organic. So that's as far as the environmental toxins. Coming to diet, the Association for International Cancer Research says they have a diet recommendation, and they do say for prevention of cancer, plant-based diet is best. So why do they say that? Well, there are a couple of unique things to plants that other foods do not have. One is fiber, and fiber is so crucial. The bacteria in our gut microbiome metabolize the fiber to produce short-chain fatty acids. They first of all use them to repair our intestinal lining, keeping it intact, prevent leaky gut. Fiber also moves out the excess estrogens that there may be there, which is maybe carcinogenic. And the bacteria then improve our immunity, aid our digestion, produce hormones like serotonin. So there are and then they also produce anti-cancer compounds. So there are many functions that the fiber does. More and as important are the polyphenols that are present in vegetables and fruits and stems and leaves. And these polyphenols are substances that the plant actually produces for its own survival, but we are the beneficiaries. And the other important thing about eating organic foods is the polyphenol content is richer in organic foods because the plant has to produce more of them because pesticides do not protect them. So there's a higher polyphenol content in organic produce versus the regular produce. Now these polyphenols, there are about 10,000 of them, and they come in like 6 different groups. The largest groups are the flavonoids, and they have marvelous health promoting effects, from cancer reduction, blood pressure control, immunity, antioxidant, anti-angiogenic effects, preventing gene toxicity. They have a whole slew of beneficial compounds and effects, and many foods have, almost all of them, a variety of them. So the intake of the polyphenols is inversely correlated with several cancers. So some of these polyphenol rich foods are, for example, the cruciferous foods, which are going down from arugula, bok choy, Brussels sprouts, broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage, kale, radishes, etc. So they have a sulfur compound, and these cruciferous vegetables prevent gene toxicity. They have anti-angiogenic properties. They have immune boosting properties. They also have aromatase inhibitor actions. The aromatase enzyme is what is in the fat cells that makes more estrogen, making fat more cancer enabling. So aromatase in these cruciferous vegetables have aromatase enzymes also inhibitors also. So the other the other category are the berries. They are immune boosting. They have multiple anti-angiogenic factors. The allium group, that's the onions, red onions especially, and garlic. In the Iowa women study that followed women prospectively for several years, postmenopausal women found there's an inverse correlation between intake of garlic and colon cancer risk, colon cancer incidence. Garlic intake has also been associated inversely or with prostate cancer and breast cancer and other cancers. The other group are mushrooms. There was one study that said if a person have 1/8 to 1/4 cup of mushrooms a day, just a small amount, there's such a remarkable reduction in overall cancers. I just found one study and it said 45%. I hope somebody does another study and proves this further, but it's a remarkable effect. Tomatoes we all know have lycopenes. This is one food that should be cooked to get the benefit of the anti-cancer polyphenol, because most of the other polyphenols are heat sensitive. Don't want to overcook it, but lycopene, tomatoes you should cook. Half a cup of tomatoes twice a week reduces prostate cancer incidence by about 30%, and those cancers will also be less aggressive. And so Mediterranean diet, we heard about Mediterranean diet earlier. So one of the key features is olive oil. There are many studies, of course. One impressive study that had about 27,000 patients, a prospective study was actually the meta-analysis of prospective studies was of olive oil, and 3 to 4 tablespoons of olive oil a day reduced esophageal cancer by 70%. I mean, this is another phenomenal number, but esophageal cancer by extra virgin olive oil, 3 to 4 tablespoons a day, by 70%, and ovarian cancer by 35%. And it also decreased breast cancer and colorectal cancer, etc. But the remarkable thing was the esophageal cancer. So if somebody has Barrett's esophagus or constant GE reflux, or is a smoker, that would be a good thing. But then we need to keep in mind that 4 tablespoons of olive oil is almost 500 calories. So that's quite a bit. But it's still something to keep in mind. So the other superfood is nuts. Why? It's there's a study out of Harvard where stage 3 colon cancer patients, when they were able to have, after surgery, when they were able to have their normal intake, they were given 2 servings of nuts per week, just 2 servings of nuts per week. One serving being 7 walnuts, 11 cashews, 17 cashews and 11 macadamia nuts, something like that. Those are the numbers. And after 6 years, those people that were having those patients who had the nuts, they had impressive disease-free survival and reduction in total overall mortality. That was really pretty impressive. So, and mushrooms is the other superfood. Mushroom has aromatase inhibitors, and they boost interferon. They have antioxidant capacity. They mobilize the immune cells. So, and the soy is the other one. Soy, a lot of people think that once somebody has breast cancer, ovarian cancer, or uterine cancer, they cannot have soy. But it has been proven over and over again that soy is safe, and in fact, soy competes for the estrogen receptors, and soy is beneficial. So there's a reduction in recurrence of breast cancer. And then we come to obesity. So obesity is also a risk factor for type 2 diabetes, and it's associated with 13 different cancers. So cause of it is being the Western pattern diet with a lot of sugar and a lot of processed foods, white flour, etc. So bariatric surgery had less recurrence of breast cancer after their bariatric surgery. So that again shows that obesity is related. I mean, it's massively related to cancer occurrence or progression or recurrence. The final thing is about exercise. Exercise is also the intensity and measured by METs. Duration of exercise is inversely related to multiple cancers, including colon, breast, uterus, kidneys, and bladder. So there was Stephen Moore is somebody who did meta-analysis of multiple studies, and he had 1.4 million people, prospective meta-analysis studies. And he found that this exercise actually this is like prevention. There was much less incidence of cancers in those people who did either moderate or higher degrees of exercise. So also breast cancer recurrence is reduced in women who exercise. So that also has been shown. So these are strong evidence that lifestyle really benefits in multiple ways. So we can, and then there's whole other thing about psychology and socialization and vagus nerve and breathing, etc. That's a whole different thing. But these are things that we can do. It's available, it's free. So there's no need to despair. Only things we have to implement. And so diet, exercise, tackling obesity, and definitely trying to avoid environmental toxins. Thank you.
Special guest I'd like to introduce and request.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, Dr. Bharat Bhosle is visiting from India. He's a trained oncologist out of Tata Cancer Hospital, DM, practiced, one of the most curious mind. And, few minutes I wanted him to give, because CWC supports a lot of
interaction is learning. I take it as a student and sitting, and I learned a lot today, right? From Dr. Kevin started telling those 4 risk factors. I will not go into details. I have been discussing last 2 days here with Mr. Mohan about nutrition, and I told the nutritional intervention should start right from the childhood. It should not start when you get the disease, be it a nephrology disease, be it a rheumatology or oncology. So right diet should be taught in the schools at very early age. And it is amazing what Dr. Padma has delivered. Obviously, we will also try to follow that. Stress, Dr. Kevin mentioned, and I have been very proponent that you should have a stress-free life, because the inflammation, which is the backbone of many diseases, including heart and cancer, I think it is a multifactorial disease. We have to understand there is not one single factor. Obviously, addictions like alcohol and then exercise. Obviously, we all are aware and we are doing our bit for exercise, but yet we have to understand there are multiple factors. In India, most of you are aware that there are no guidelines stated by the government, like you have a US task force, you go for many screening. The second talk by Dr. Girish was very exciting for me. He said there is taste does not mean you should do it. Can is not equal to should. It's excellent. I took a picture of it. And I have been telling that, no, it's not for only screening. If you have a drug, that does not mean you should always act. So there are many interventions. You have a great responsibility when you have this knowledge and so many tests available to you. In India, there is we have a problem that less expertise are available. Though there are radiologists, they are not been trained to pick up the screening things. If you do a CT scan, you may end up in unnecessary biopsies many times. They have their own complications. We may not be equipped in the 2-tier, 3-tier cities to deal with the complications. Another challenge is a good pathologist. Every doctor is good, but then if they are not trained with a high volume diagnostic centers, then again it's a bit problem. Cancer diagnostic has moved from conventional pathology to immunohistochemistry, And today we have so much of, no, I'm here sitting within their one cell lab and they are dealing with single cell in the blood. So we have moved from conventional pathology to a genomics. So we have to incorporate large data. And we as a clinician, we feel that we don't have a full knowledge about all the diagnostics. So these interactions are very important in my, back in the India, in screening, like, cervical cancer. Majority of the deaths in rural females are happening because of the cervical cancer, and a simple test like pap smear, like you showed in its level A evidence, right, in cervical cancer and colon cancer, hardly any cervical screening is happening. You showed that 76% screening regularly happening in 2013. It's less than single digit in India. Colon cancer, you showed it's again a level A. You can prevent, and there in India, even educated minds, now doctors are also not going for 5 yearly colonoscopy. It's once in 5 years you have to do colonoscopy. Simple test like fecal occult blood. I do think now in a country like low and middle income countries, not only India, the other countries, simple tests which are fecal occult blood once in a 5 year colonoscopy can actually detect and prevent mortality. Cervical cancer, there is a paper which was published by Tata Memorial Hospital's preventive cancer department, where Dr. Shastri, who is a preventive oncologist, he came here and presented his paper in ASCO 10 years back, and that got a standing ovation. But again, it was a simple intervention of pap smear with Lugol's iodine, not HPV test. And they showed that cervical cancer mortality, I'm telling mortality, can be reduced by 40% in a underprivileged area of Dharavi. It's a slum area in Mumbai, where there is the biggest slum of Asia, and they did this study in Dharavi with Anganwadi workers. These are paramedical staffs, and they showed that if simple tests can reduce the 40% mortality. And we have to understand, even if you are vaccinated for HPV, screening with PAP or HPV is important. People are taking those vaccination, but the actual thing which reduces mortality is not the vaccination, it's the screening. Even here, I think US Task Force recommend that you have to go for regular screening after the 21 of age till 65 of 2 tests of 5 yearly. So there is a lot of learning for me, and we try and advocate all this preventive, especially the diet. I'm a very big fan of promoting diet. Obviously I have to apply that to myself also to improvise my the body mass index. So thank you so much.
What is the crystal ball when it comes to managing with all the technology, all these AI, etc.? So, Kevin, if I may, request your last word and your crystal ball as to where this field is moving, and is there a hope, to what we say from, catastrophe to a manageable disease, and over what period of time?
I do have some fears that this technology will be utilized before it's perfected. I mean, I have friends who've already done cancer screening tests and whole body imaging, who are otherwise healthy and are making sure that they don't have cancer. But I think that over time, the precision of precision oncology and precision screening tests will continue to improve to the point where it becomes very useful. I also think that we'll have to understand more about the dynamics of cancer growth, in that if we pick up malignant clones earlier and earlier, do we have a way to differentiate them back to normal tissue without actually doing surgical excision or things like that? And monitoring, I think, will be dramatically improved.
Great. Thank you. Girish, your final word and your crystal ball.
I was trying to think about what I could add that would be incremental to what Kevin just said. I'm not sure that I have anything that great. I agree. Look, especially given the geography that we live in here in the San Francisco Bay Area. We have a lot of what I call the Palo Alto hypochondriacs, right? So we have people with plenty of disposable income who are hyper-focused and vigilant about their health. And that's, generally speaking, don't get me wrong, I'm probably one of them, right? It's generally speaking a good thing. But I think that, as in many cases, like with Google's new AI that they started using in their search engine last week, and everybody's wondering about what implications that'll have for news organizations who generate the content that Google searches. The technology is in front of our understanding of the science and the biology. So I guess if I have a crystal ball, or I don't know if it's so much a crystal ball, is more a desire for us as humanity. It's that we do think about, we pay close attention to the should part of that equation that I shared earlier, and not just the can part of that equation, and try to find a reasonable balance that's not as heavily shaped by commercial interest with what we should do and what evidence is sort of good enough for us to make this something that we recommend to our, our patients and our friends, frankly. I don't know if that's so much a crystal ball, but that's just a hope and a desire on my part.
Nutritional guidance for thyroid cancer.
I think there is not something specific unless the person is hypothyroid or hyperthyroid, but then that is medically managed. So I think following the recommendations that, to follow a good diet, fruits and vegetables, less meat, definitely less processed meat, or no processed meat, less alcohol or no alcohol. Those are the guidance. And then, exercise, avoid environmental damage, etc., carcinogens, etc.
Thank you, Dr. Padma. I do want to recognize Dr. Sachin Deshmukh, and he's our co-chair of the track, and he's been a great supporter. Sachin, do you have any last question for any of the panel members?
I think it was very awesome presentation and very thought-provoking, and it kind of inspires us to the work we are taking on. It's in the right direction, and we have very nice, wonderful team of people from nutrigenomics to just kind of the individualization to precision to the technology and also common sense, which overrides everything. So I'm very happy. It was a very excellent session, and thank you for all the faculty and their contributions. And we want to do more in this field because, as you know, the cancer is becoming household name, which is little scary, and we want to make the cancer history, and everybody should have that kind of, well-being and things like that. Yeah.
Good things. Unfortunately, we have to end, but I want to thank, the panelists for the time they've taken. I really appreciate on behalf of all of us, the volunteers of CWC, and all of us, this will go on.